My computer's missing that extra hour of sleep. It's running slow this morning. And I'm right there with it, let me tell you. Well, I hope you've had a good week. And I know that this world is not our home, that we're looking for a heavenly country. And assemblies like this are designed to help us in our journey from this life to the next. I've decided to talk to you this morning about a rather strange but true story of a man who really had the potential to be great, but he made the wrong choices in his life, and those choices eventually took him to disgrace and death. It's important for us to remember that the people that we read about in the Bible were real people. They lived at a real time and place in history, and they experienced the same feelings and emotions. They dealt with the same kinds of problems that we deal with. They had the same hopes and dreams and fears. Now that's important because when we look at various Bible characters, we can also see a glimpse of ourselves. If you've been in our Wednesday night Bible class, you may have already guessed that I'm going to talk with you this morning about the rise and fall of King Saul. You know that he was a man with great potential in the beginning, and he began well. But sadly, his story did not have a happy ending. It truly was a rags to riches story. And I know that for those in our Wednesday night Bible class, this will be a bit of a review. I hope that you won't mind that. They say that the first law of learning is repetition, repetition, repetition. And so, although we've been looking at the life of this man over several weeks now, it's not going to hurt us to review the things that we've talked about and then look at some important lessons that we can learn. As I've already mentioned, Saul saw great potential as he began his story. And so let's talk for a few minutes about Saul's rise and the various advantages that he had. And let me begin by reminding you that Saul had a powerful and an influential father. He was the son of Kish. He was from the tribe of Benjamin. And Kish is described by the inspired historian as a mighty man of power. Well, that would have given Saul some advantages in his early life. And then the historian tells us that Saul was an imposing physical specimen. In fact, he is described in 1 Samuel chapter 9. You might turn in your Old Testaments to the book of 1 Samuel. We'll be looking at selected passages along the way. We obviously can't look at everything that the record tells us about King Saul. But in 1 Samuel chapter 9 and verse 2, he is described as choice and handsome. In fact, the New King James says there was not a more handsome person among the children of Israel than Saul. And he was taller, a head taller than everybody else. Well, I think we all understand that a good physical appearance can be helpful to us in this life. And I want to remind you that in the early part of this story, there is clear evidence that Saul was a young man who was considerate of his father. You may recall that Kish's donkeys strayed away, and he sent Saul out to find them. And they searched here and there, and they couldn't find the donkeys. And about 3 days later, Saul said to his servant in 1 Samuel 9, verse 5, "Come, let us return, lest my father cease caring about the donkeys and become worried about us." That really is an admirable quality. A lot of young people don't care about what their parents think or how their parents feel. That obviously was not the case with Saul. And then, in his early days, he was a man of genuine humility. When Samuel anointed Saul to be the first king in Israel, he said to Saul, "And on whom is all the desire of Israel? Is it not on you and all your father's house?" And notice how Saul responds in 1 Samuel 9, verse 21, "Am I not a Benjamite of the smallest of the tribes of Israel, and my family the least of all the families of the tribe of Benjamin? Why then do you speak like this to me?" And may I remind you that when Samuel revealed to the people that Saul would be the first king over Israel, they began to search for Saul. And you remember, they couldn't find him. They couldn't find him because he was hiding among the equipment. In fact, the Lord revealed his location. The Lord said, 1 Samuel 10, verse 22, "There he is, hidden among the equipment." Now, to be honest with you, I'm not sure how to interpret Saul's actions on that occasion. Was this an expression of humility, or was it an indication of his reluctance to serve as the first king over Israel? Be that as it may, something that Samuel says to Saul later on in the story clearly indicates that Saul's humility at first was genuine. It wasn't a pretense. In 1 Samuel chapter 15 and verse 17, Samuel said to Saul, "When you were little in your own eyes, were you not head of the tribes of Israel, and did not the Lord anoint you king over Israel?" And so Saul began his reign with the kind of attitude that every leader should have. He was also granted signs or assurances from God that God was with him. We read about that in 1 Samuel chapter 7, or chapter 10 rather. Verse 7 tells us, "And let it be, when these signs come to you, that you do as the occasion demands, for God is with you." And skipping down to verse 9, it reads, "So it was, when he had turned his back to go from Samuel, that God gave him another heart, and all those signs came to pass that day." So Saul really didn't have to worry or wonder if God was really with him in the beginning of his reign. God assures him of that fact. And then please notice with me that early in his reign, Saul manifested self-control and moderation. You see, not everybody wanted Saul to be the first king. There were some who opposed his anointing. There were some who asked the question, 1 Samuel 10, verse 27, "How can this man save us?" And we're told that these people actually despised Saul. And they didn't bring him any gifts, which would have been customary, evidently. But the record says, "But he held his peace." And in 1 Samuel chapter 11 and in verse 12, the people said to Samuel, "Who is he who said, 'Shall Saul reign over us? Bring the men that we may put them to death.'" They were saying this after Saul had led them into victory against Nahash, the Ammonite who besieged Jabesh Gilead. And notice what Saul said in return. He says in verse 13, "Not a man shall be put to death this day, for today the Lord has accomplished salvation in Israel." Notice that Saul realized that it really wasn't he who was responsible for the victory, but rather it was the Lord. And then Saul was a genuine military hero. As I just mentioned, when Nahash the Ammonite went up and besieged Jabesh Gilead, they got word to Saul, and Saul assembled an army, and he came and he rescued the inhabitants of that city. And then even afterwards, Saul led his people out to battle against his victories. And in 1 Samuel chapter 14 and verse 47, the writer tells us, "So Saul established his sovereignty over Israel." And he mentions Saul's victories over Moab and Ammon and Edom and the kings of Zobah and the Philistines and the Amalekites. So I think all of us can see that in the very beginning, Saul paints a picture of someone who was humble and promising and commendable and admirable. He was a man who had wonderful opportunities to serve God. But I know you know the rest of the story. And so let's talk about Saul's fall. Like so many other people who do not live up to what they could be, that was the case with Saul. And his fall began when he disobeyed Samuel's instructions with respect to offering a sacrifice in Gilgal. Now that part of the story is recorded for us in 1 Samuel chapter 13. I'm sure most of you remember the story. Samuel told Saul to wait in Gilgal for 7 days, that Samuel would come and offer the sacrifice. And Saul didn't wait, and he offered the sacrifice instead. When we were looking at this passage in our Wednesday night Bible study, I pointed out that Saul really was facing some extenuating circumstances. He faced a superior enemy force. And his people were so afraid that many of them were hiding in the holes of the earth, and some had fled for safety across the Jordan. And those who stayed with Saul were terrified, and then Samuel didn't come when Saul expected him. How did he know that Samuel was going to come at all? Perhaps something had happened to Samuel. Perhaps he was unavoidably detained. Perhaps the Philistines had captured or killed Samuel. And then on top of all of that, Saul's army was deserting. And he told Samuel that he didn't want to go into battle without entreating the favor of the Lord. He was outmanned and outgunned by the Philistines. And so he said he forced himself, but we all understand that those extenuating circumstances did not justify his disobedience. You see, since Saul was not a priest, he had no right to offer those sacrifices. And though it might appear on the surface that Saul acted out of reverence, it was rash and presumptuous, and it was sinful. And then another step in Saul's decline is his disobedience with respect to the Amalekites. I know you're familiar with that story recorded for us in 1 Samuel 15. God commanded Saul to utterly destroy the Amalekites and all of their animals. And Saul did what God told him to do, almost. He killed everybody, but he spared Agag the king, and he spared the best of the animals for sacrifice. And so he didn't really obey the Lord. It's interesting to me that if those animals were offered in sacrifice, would they have been killed according to God's instructions? Well, technically, yes. But not in the way that the Lord intended. Saul was obedient to the Lord almost. But then, of course, another step in Saul's fall was his envy and his hatred of David. After David went out and fought the giant Goliath and was victorious with the Lord's help, Saul made him a commander over his army, and they went out and they were victorious over the Philistines, and they came back and the women were crying out, Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s, and all that caused Saul to envy David and to hate him. And I know that you remember that on at least 2 different occasions, Saul tried to kill David with his spear. He gave David his daughter Michal to be his wife, requiring David to provide 100 foreskins from the Philistines as the dowry. Saul, of course, was thinking that David would be killed in battle. And when that little scheme didn't work, David flees, and for quite some time Saul chases David from place to place all over the southern part of Palestine, trying to capture him and kill him. The historian tells us in 1 Samuel 23 and verse 14, and David stayed in the strongholds in the wilderness and remained in the mountains in the wilderness of Ziph. Saul sought him every day, but God did not deliver him into his hands. I know you also remember that on 2 different occasions, the Lord delivered Saul into David's hands, and on both of those occasions, in the cave at En-gedi and in the wilderness of Ziph, David spared Saul's life. Saul eventually came to understand that God intended David to be the king. That must necessarily mean that his attempts to murder David were actually efforts to thwart God's purposes. And then may I remind you that in Saul's hatred of David, he orders the murder of God's priests because Ahimelech had helped David by giving him some of the showbread. As you think about that, Let me remind you that Saul had once prophesied with the prophets of God. And now he's commanding the priests of God to be slain. And then, of course, Saul consulted a medium. We just talked about that. I guess it was this last Wednesday night. Samuel had died. Saul had expelled all of the mediums and spiritists from the land, following the instructions of the Lord. And Saul is facing the Philistines, and he inquires of the Lord, and the Lord does not answer him. And so in desperation, Saul instructs his servants to find him a medium, and they do. And Saul disguises himself and goes and consults this medium. And no doubt you remember the rest of that story. And we pointed this out Wednesday night, that when this woman realizes that she's actually talking to Saul, she's afraid that Saul will spare her life, and Saul swears by the Lord that he will not do that. And so isn't it ironic that here he is swearing by the Lord to spare this woman's life, which was in direct violation of the Lord's instructions. The Lord had commanded back in Leviticus chapter 20 and verse 6 that those who consult mediums were to be cut off from the people, and that the mediums were to be put to death. Saul is ignoring all of that and swearing by the Lord to spare this woman's life in the process. And we haven't got to this part of the story on Wednesday night, but you know, I trust from other studies, that Saul went out to battle against the Philistines, and he was severely wounded, mortally wounded. And lest to be abused by his enemies, he instructed his armor bearer to finish him off, and the armor bearer refused to do that, and so Saul fell on his own sword. And that's the way Saul's story ends. He was a man who could have risen to greatness, but instead he fell into sin, and he kept sinking deeper and deeper until he died. In his last encounter with David, Saul said something to David that I think pretty well encapsulates his life. He said in 1 Samuel 26, verse 21, "Behold, I have played the fool and have erred exceedingly." Well, what can we learn from the rise and fall of Saul? Well, I think one of the lessons we learn is that two choices lie before each one of us. We can either rise in faithful service to the Lord, or we can waste our lives in sin. I know that you understand that God made us with the ability to make choices. And God allows us to exercise our volition. Saul had the ability to either rise or fall, and God gave him the freedom to choose. And those same choices lie before each one of us. Each one of us can decide to be faithful and godly, or we can decide to waste our lives in sin. Which choice will be made? Another lesson that we learn from Saul is that we must not only start out well, we must end well as well. As we've already said, like Solomon, Saul began in a very promising way, but he allowed himself to be ruined by sin. And Saul's life illustrates one of the most solemn warnings that's found in Scripture. The prophet Ezekiel tells us in Ezekiel chapter 18 and verse 24, "But when a righteous man turns away from his righteousness and commits iniquity, and does according to all the abominations that the wicked man does, shall he live?" Well, Ezekiel answers that question. He says, "All the righteousness which he has done shall not be remembered, because of the unfaithfulness of which he is guilty, and the sin which he has committed, because of them he shall die." All of us need to ask ourselves the question, has something like that happened to me? Brother Luther Blackman was a well-known preacher in Texas. He died before I lived in Texas. I just heard preachers talk about him. And I understand that Brother Blackman used to talk about wasers and isers. I think we all understand that sometimes people pride themselves on what they used to be and what they used to do rather than on what they're now doing. We've got to do more than start out well. We've got to end well. I know preachers with amazing ability who have really hurt themselves because they got involved in immorality or some other sin. A third lesson that we learn from Saul is that we must do God's work in God's ways. When Saul spared Agag, the king of the Amalekites, and the best of the animals, he was not doing God's work. God had said, kill all the Amalekites, destroy all the animals. As I've already said, he did most of what God commanded him to do. In fact, you could say he did almost everything that God commanded him to do. But he was not completely obedient to the Lord, and the Lord cared about that. Partial obedience or incomplete obedience is disobedience. When Saul offered the sacrifice at Gilgal, he was doing God's work. But he wasn't doing God's work in God's way. Offering animal sacrifices was certainly God's prescribed work. But it wasn't God's way for a king to do that. That was something that priests were to do, and Saul was not a priest. In religion, God's work and only God's work is good, and only God's way is right. And so we need to do God's work in God's way. David found out how important that is the hard way when he brought the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem on an ox cart, and I know you know that story. The oxen stumbled, the ark started to fall off the cart. Uzzah was walking behind. He stretched out his hand to steady the ark, and God struck him dead. There is not a doubt in my mind that Uzzah had the very best of intentions. He didn't want the ark to be damaged or destroyed, and yet no one was to touch the ark. And in 1 Chronicles chapter 15, after this incident, David said to his people in verse 2, "No one may carry the ark of God but the Levites, for the Lord has chosen them to carry the ark of God." And then just a few verses later, down in verse 13, David told his people, "For because you did not do it the first time, the Lord our God broke out against us because we did not consult him about the proper order." Another lesson that we learn from Saul is that God will abandon us if we abandon him. As long as Saul lived right, God was with him. But when he left God, God left him. And we are told more than once that the Spirit of God departed from Saul. And that is in keeping with God, with what God promised his people. The chronicler tells us in 2 Chronicles chapter 15, "The Lord is with you while you are with him. If you seek him, he will be found by you. But if you forsake him, he will forsake you." And we need to be impressed with the fact that what happened to Saul can happen to us today. And then the rise and fall of Saul reminds us that if we do not quickly turn away from our sin, it can drag us deeper and deeper into iniquity. If Saul had really repented of his earlier sins, he could have been forgiven. I believe he would have been forgiven by the Lord, and he could have been a great man. David was a great man, but David made some terrible, terrible mistakes. That's really putting it too softly. David sinned grievously. But David turned from his sins and sought God's forgiveness. And so the story of Saul is a sad story of what could have been. May we learn not to make the kind of mistakes that he made. Thank you.